Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in for this VISION-DMD webinar. My name is Suzanne, and I'm from the World Duchenne organization, and we're here with Dr. Holly Peay, Dr. Laurie Conklin, and Suzanne Gaglianon. And together we're hosting this webinar on returning individual clinical trial data back to the families. And in the upcoming hour, we will hear everything about the challenges and opportunities of returning this type of data, how this is done, and what you can do with it. Now, this webinar is initiated by VISION-DMD, which is a European project aiming to develop a therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And this is done by investigating the safety and the efficacy of vamorolone in ambulant DMD boys. And we're currently having our phase 2b clinical trials in multiple centers in multiple countries. And if you want to learn more about this project, I'd like to visit you for vision-dmd.info. So a bit about our speakers for today. We have Dr. Holly Peay, Dr. Laurie Conklin, and Suzanne Gaglianon joining us. Dr. Peay is a senior research scientist in genomics, bioinformatics, and the Translational Research Center at RTA International. Dr. Laurie Conklin is a pediatric gastroenterologist interested in pediatric drug development, and she was also awarded a bioethics grant to conduct a study facilitating the return of patient data from the vamorolone studies back to the families. And if you're participating in one of the studies, I'm sure you've heard of Suzanne Gaglianon, who is the centralized study coordinator at ReveraGen. She is the intermediary between the study site and the families, who is facilitating the data return in a safe way. So an overview of the topics of today. We start with Dr. Peay, who will kick off and tell you of everything about the chances, but also the implications of returning clinical research. She'll give some examples and will tell us what kind of specific research results can and cannot be shared. Then we have Dr. Conklin and Suzanne talking about ReveraGen's innovative approach to returning this individual patient data and how families participating in the clinical trial can request this. And lastly, we'll have some time to discuss the questions that are popping up in the chat box with our speakers in the Q&A. So please make sure to use this comment box in your advantage. Now that's all for me for now. I'd like to give the floor now to Dr. Holly Peay to start her presentation on the ethical return of clinical research results.
Excellent, thank you. All right, well, I'm very happy to be here to talk a bit about these some of the issues associated with return of research results. I think it's very easy and sort of intuitive for people to think, of course, return research results, that's the right thing to do. And in many respects, that kind of idea about research is driving a lot of the discussion, that it's the right thing to do. But there are actually a lot of complexities and challenges that come along with returning research results. And so we're going to talk through some of those. And I'm really hoping to do an introduction, set the stage for the group for some of these challenges and opportunities, and raise some questions for people to think through. And then, as you've heard, then we're going to hear more from Dr. Conklin about an actual experience doing this kind of return of research results. And again, that kind of experience of actually working through some of these challenges and opportunities. So I'm going to do an introduction and lay some groundwork for the group. All right, first of all, I'm going to tell you my graphics have a lot of babies in them, and those are the graphics that I have on hand from a recent study. And so I know that many of you are thinking about research for young adults, for thinking about research for yourself as adults. And so the babies are cute, and I hope everyone's okay with having babies on the picture, but they're what I have available. So, okay, so the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the difference between research and clinical care. You're going to hear this again. Dr. Conklin's going to talk about this again in her presentation, and it just demonstrates the importance of really making sure that we differentiate when we're talking about going and having your routine care with your healthcare team and participating in research. We tend, as researchers, as people living with particular healthcare conditions, and as parents of people living with healthcare conditions, to want to conflate those things, to want to kind of lump them together. And it's really important, especially when we talk about returning results, that we very carefully differentiate those two things. So you know, when you go to your doctor or your healthcare providers for clinical care, the intention of that healthcare provider is to develop treatments or management that is really for you. It is directed right at you. Typically, the kinds of care that you're getting are things that have been approved or are very well understood. And so it's something that is based on an evidence base that is already there. Research is quite different. The goal of research is to develop new knowledge. It is not to help or treat any individual. And in fact, research is directed at the group of participants in either a clinical research study or a clinical trial. And the goal is not to help any single person in that clinical trial. Of course, everyone hopes that will happen, but that's not the goal. So it's just very important that we keep those things clear in our mind as we think about return of research results. We're going to spend most of the discussion today focused on clinical trials, and you all know a lot about clinical trials, but they are experiments and it is research. And again, we're talking about differentiating clinical care where we're looking at individual treatment for individual people and a clinical trial where we're testing in an experiment whether a new treatment or intervention might work. All right, so we're going to keep making sure that we're touching base about that differentiation as we go through today. Another thing that's important to keep in mind as we talk about return of results is what kind of results are we thinking about returning. It's very different when we think about returning group level results. So overall, how has the study done? What have we learned overall in the study versus individual results? They're really across the world, there is agreement that group level results should be returned back to research participants. It is clearly the ethical thing to do. People should not participate in research and then not know what happened in the research study. So on the clinical trial level, that would be things like whether the clinical trial met its endpoint. Did the trial succeed? Overall, how did people in the trial do? And that's a really different discussion than returning individual results. So one person in the trial, what actually happened to that person. And in most of this presentation, we're going to focus on that return of individual level research results where things get actually more complicated. So going back to this idea of the ethics of this return of research results, there's a really nice recent publication that came out from the US National Academy of Science. And there, I have a reference for this at the end. And anyone who's particularly excited about this topic, I recommend that you at least look at the summary, and as well the EU has some related kinds of materials. But it's really a very thoughtful discussion about when and how research results should be returned. And this is a quote from this group of investigators and some clinical trial participants about how they sort of think overall about this idea of return of research results. And it's this concept that people are curious about themselves, and that's a big part of why people participate in research. They're curious about their own health and their family's health. And overall, individuals feel a sense of frustration and loss when investigators take from them, so take data, take samples, take their time, but do not share back their research results. So we have this kind of basic concept in bioethics that we need to be treating people fairly, and that people deserve to actually receive their results when they've participated in research. All right, and it's actually part of what underpins the whole research enterprise, that if people are not willing to participate in research, then the whole research enterprise falls apart. Right, so it's important to researchers as well. But now we're going to get into some of these challenges. So again, it's I think quite easy, especially for families who are very well informed and are in communities like this community where people tend to be quite engaged and active. And it's easy to imagine that everyone wants their individual research results, and that's actually not true. I mean, there have been some empirical studies, and certainly there's anecdotal experience from different clinician researchers, and truly not everyone wants those results back, especially if the results are uncertain. And research results tend to be uncertain to some extent. And we'll talk a bit more about why and how that's important. But it really is important to keep in mind that not everyone wants this data back. So part of this process needs to be understanding who wants results and what results they want. And again, you're going to hear a bit more about how that's been actualized in the study when Dr. Conklin talks about her approach. But perhaps even more challenging are these questions about what results to return and when. There are many, many different kinds of research results that come out of, staying with clinical trials as our example, that come out of clinical trials. And some of those results are much more straightforward than others, and some are much better understood than others. And so it's very challenging. And actually there has been years and years of debate within the clinical research and bioethics world about how we define when results are meaningful and ready for people to receive them. And so let's kind of dive down a bit more into some of these questions. So one of the kind of key questions is, how well understood do results need to be to make them worth returning? I'm going to show two examples that I hope will differentiate this. But remember that research is tries to understand something. And along the way, very often we find things in clinical research that we don't really understand. And so when do we say, okay, let's start to return things to people when the researchers truly do not understand the implications or the meaning of a particular finding? It's a challenging thing to do. It's a challenging thing for researchers to articulate to potential participants or participants what those results mean. And it's a difficult thing as a participant to receive a result that you really don't know the implications of. That can be a real challenge. And again, I'll give you an example in a minute. Then we have a related question about what type of results are meaningful to participants. There are, again, many different data points that come out, for example, of a clinical trial, and some of them have a lot more relevance and meaning to people's lives than others do. So how do we make determinations about meaningful results? And then finally, how can researchers avoid harm? So one of the key ethical tenets in clinical practice and in clinical research is avoiding harm. It's it's underlying really all of the regulations around the world about how research is done. We want to avoid harm. And we tend to think about avoiding harm in terms of avoiding physical harm. You know, for example, having a really bad side effect in a clinical trial, but there are also psychological harms that can be really important and meaningful to people. And we want to make sure that we are avoiding both kinds of harms. And return of results can potentially cause both of them. So there have been situations that have been reported in the literature where researchers have returned individual level results that people have misunderstood, and they have taken an action. So they've actually gone, for example, and done a different kind of healthcare treatment than they otherwise would have based on a result that was quite uncertain, and it had a negative impact on them. So we need to be careful about that kind of harm, but also about people feeling uncertain and anxious because there is a result returned to them that folks simply don't understand. And by folks, I mean the research team as well, right? So they're important questions, and this is something that the whole world is being challenged with as we're more and more being open to returning individual results to individuals. All right, so like I said, I'm going to give you two types of examples and just sort of think through as a thought experiment, get us ready to hear from Dr. Conklin about how this has actually been implemented in her study. So we're going to consider two different kinds of research results just to think through how these things might be actualized. Okay, so the first is an image of a child climbing stairs, and we're gonna use this as an example of, let's say there's a 4-stair climb as part of a clinical trial. So this is a pretty straightforward kind of assessment, all right? And thinking through this, we're gonna start with this concrete assessment, and we're gonna start with 3 concepts about whether the results are true, whether they're understood, and whether they're meaningful, okay? So true, the veracity of a result, let's use an example of whether it's reproducible. So if you have 2 researchers who are both timing a child walking up 4 stairs, they are very likely to get the same result, okay? If you have a child walk up stairs again with the same investigator timing that child, and the child has exactly the same, is having the same kind of day and is having the same kind of function, you should get pretty similar results. Those results tend to be relatively reproducible. All right, so we feel like in general that these kind of results can be true, although there are lots of variables associated with how people do on this test. The test is understood. This is a very straightforward assessment. We are timing a child walking upstairs. We understand not only what the results mean, but it's easy for us as a community to understand 4 stairs. This is something we see our children doing. We do ourselves every day. We understand this. This conceptually makes sense. And then in terms of it being meaningful, it is very easy to imagine having a child who is either doing better or worse on 4-stair climb, and having that be something that we can then say, okay, if my child can climb stairs faster or better or feel more comfortable doing it, this would translate into other kinds of activities, right? So you all, I hope, are following that this is something that this kind of result is fairly concrete, it is fairly reproducible, and it's fairly well understood and meaningful. But let's use a different kind of example. Let's say that the investigators are also looking for a chemical in the blood. And that chemical is something that we know is in people's blood, and we understand something about the chemical structure, but we don't know what it does in the body. And we don't know what it does in the body in healthy people, and we're curious about whether it might do something different in people who have Duchenne. So this very exploratory kind of research where we might have different laboratory approaches to actually measure that chemical. And so saying is the result true, it might be that if you have different laboratory tests do that result, they might find different results. Do we understand what it means? We don't. It's again, it's a chemical floating in our blood. We don't know what it does in healthy people, and we certainly don't know how it might impact Duchenne. This is very exploratory early research. Is it meaningful? If you got that result as a parent, would that be meaningful? If you got the result as an individual living with Duchenne, would it be meaningful to you? And the answer is probably not. And so this kind of results become a bit more challenging. So then I'll kind of end with this idea of what education and support do participants need when we return their results. So there's clearly an obligation of individuals when they return results, of researchers when they return results, to provide some context. And that can be a real challenge. This is something that research teams traditionally don't have the expertise to do. They're developing new expertise to do this kind of return of results, but there are a lot of challenges, and Dr. Conklin will discuss some of those. Some of those are regulatory challenges, some of them are practical challenges, but we clearly can't just hand results to people and expect them to be meaningful. They need some interpretation. And so there's a lot of work in the community about how we actually do that well. And again, you're going to hear an excellent result example coming up. So just to sort of summarize the challenges and opportunities, so we have to differentiate research from clinical care. It's really important. Not all research results are the same. So we need to really think carefully about what results are meaningful to return and which ones may not be. There can be harms from result disclosure. We need to be careful about those. And returning individual results does place new burdens on research teams. but the opportunities are quite significant, and increasingly the ethics community and the clinical research community is starting to really lean toward the opportunities outweighing the challenges and are working towards solutions. And you're going to hear a nice example in a moment. Of course, this respects participants and families and helps ensure that we're not treating them as a means to an end. It promotes autonomy. It encourages future research participation. The results may actually be important, and they may be important clinically, but they also might be important. We have this concept of personal utility. It might just be important to you to feel like you understand yourself and your body, which is a part of why people do research. So you might find them meaningful to yourself, even if you can't do anything with them. And it allows more transparency and engagement in the research process. And I know that's a big thing that this community is working toward. So we have more justification to do this return of results as we're learning more and more about clinical research. The quote here makes, I think, an important point that I do want to leave the group with, that we need to make sure that as we advance this discussion about return of results, that we engage participants and families, again, about the idea of what's meaningful and what's valuable, and incorporate on an individual level people's own needs and preferences in their return of results. This should not be a yes or no for everyone in a research study. It should be really customized, so people should have a choice of whether they receive different kinds of results. So finally, just to raise a few points for consideration as we go through the rest of today's discussion is who gets to decide, right? I mean, this is a big question. Who gets to decide whether and when research results are ready to be returned? What would a meaningful result mean to you as an individual? Do you think there are results that should never be returned, or at least not now? And who should be responsible for explaining the results to participants and families? These are important questions that we need to deal with as a community. All right, with that, I'm going to thank you for my time. My contact information is here. I'm happy to answer any questions or communicate with folks offline. But for now, I'm going to actually turn this over to Dr. Conklin.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. And I really appreciate World Duchenne Organization for allowing us to give this presentation and speak directly to the community about how we're returning results to parents of the boys in the VISION-DMD clinical trials. My name is Lori Conklin, and I have Suzanne Gaglianone on the slide as well. She's going to join at the end in case she's definitely, for some questions, can help to answer in a better way than I can. And so she really helps to bring some depth to the question and answer part. So as Holly touched on, informing participants what was learned from the research is an important ethical principle of research and one that's well recognized. As Holly mentioned, the one way that we're able to return group clinical trial data, or as I refer to it as aggregate clinical trial data, is on a website called clinicaltrials.gov. And that's a website many of you know because you can access available clinical trials there. But you can also see that in completed trials, sponsors are required to post results there. Now, those results are posted by the dose group or by the arm. So, for example, placebo group versus active treatment group. And they're aggregate data, meaning that what is shown is like the average of the entire dose group. There's no individual data there, but you can go there to access completed trial aggregate results. So when thinking about this, you can think about different types of data sharing. And so we are talking about here this individual participants' clinical trial results, receiving your own clinical trial or your child's clinical trial results. And then as I showed just a minute ago on clinicaltrials.gov, you can look at aggregate data from participants in one trial. You can also talk about sharing data from different clinical trials in order to combine them or use them together to give you a more powerful database that can be useful within the community. And then down at the bottom here, it shouldn't be at the bottom because it's very important, is your clinical history, your electronic medical records, your individual clinical data. And these are different in that your individual clinical trial results and your clinical history are connected to you. They're connected with a person. Whereas these other data, like those on clinicaltrial.gov and in the data that may be shared, that are, sometimes we talk about common data points that can be combined from different trials, that's de-identified data. So your child's identification is not associated with that data. And these different types of data, there's different reasons for sharing them and to think about sharing them and to share them with whom. So we talk about sharing data from clinical trials in order to accelerate progress, in order to generate knowledge, to accelerate drug development and development of new technologies to help people. Sharing data can potentially reduce costs, it can reduce burden, and it can reduce the number of patients that receive placebo. And the Duchenne community has really had a lot of discussions about sharing placebo data so that fewer patients need to be enrolled in placebo arms in clinical trials. And this is all very important. There's also an importance to trial participant engagement. And so this is, as Holly was touching on, sharing data to patients and parents who want access to the study findings and study data. And companies want participant engagement. That's important to companies as well. And regulators want patient engagement in their studies. And so it's something that does have appeal across the board in order to engage participants in the trial and not have them feel like they're just giving and not receiving back. And clinical history and electronic medical records have a very different, there's a very different reason for sharing that data. And that is to improve your child's health. So it's important that your healthcare providers are able to share data between them. And you have a right to be an active participant in your child's healthcare and receive that data. There's a difference, as Holly talked about as well, between clinical and research testing. So clinical testing are tests that are ordered by your doctor to evaluate your child's health and take care of your child, whereas tests that are ordered in research are chosen and conducted by researchers to answer a scientific question or to assess safety or efficacy of a new treatment. Sometimes these overlap. So we have physicians, for example, safety laboratory testing that's done during trials. If there's an abnormal lab test, there is a medical monitor in the trial who reviews those results and then sometimes communicates with the patient's physician if something needs to be repeated or addressed for safety. But many times these are really separate and are done to answer different questions. So as I said, aggregate data are available and they're made available on clinicaltrials.gov, but also in publications that are available and presentations at meetings to the scientific community. We heard from foundations that families also want access to their child's individual data. And so that started some discussions at ReveraGen. We are a small company that has been supported generously by government foundations and Duchenne foundations, and we need to listen to the needs of families. But we know, as Holly said, there's a lot of data collected in the trials that won't be very helpful to parents or physicians. And so, but that question of meaningfulness was brought up upon a lot of discussion about how can we decide what is meaningful and what would be important to parents of the boys in the trials. And then there were a lot of operational discussions. How can we do this and what are the barriers? For example, barriers around informed consent, barriers around how we should put the data together, barriers around who should deliver the data, barriers around burden on, for example, asking the sites to do a lot of work to return data back to patients wasn't something that we had initially discussed with them when we brought them on as clinical trial sites. And we also wanted to do this in an efficient way. both efficient in time and efficient in cost. And so we discussed these issues with several Duchenne foundations, and we also discussed these ideas with several neurologists, and we had a lot of support for this idea, and so wanted to pursue it further, trying to put together a plan. One of the really critical pieces to putting together such a plan has been Suzanne, and Suzanne is Michael's mom, and she's also a valued ReveraGen team member. Suzanne is our travel coordinator, and so she is already communicating with many of our trial families to help set up their travel. And Suzanne echoed that return of individual research results would be important to families. She also agreed to take on the role basically of the coordinator or a firewall between the families and the study team. It's important to realize that as a study team, we aren't supposed to know who the participants are, because it's important that the data that we see are anonymous and aren't associated with any particular patients. But Suzanne is a way for us to bridge that, and she acts as a firewall between the families and the study team. And I'll go into that in a little more detail with the process, identifying the process. So we know this process is new, and we want to learn from the process, what works, what doesn't work. And so we decided to approach this as a learning experience. We applied for a US National Institutes of Health bioethics grant that was funded. We designed a protocol that centralized operations through Suzanne, and so there is no involvement in the clinics from the start. And we have a central ethics committee that provides independent oversight for return of results from 11 countries. That was approved. And we designed electronic surveys that we intend to and have been sending to families. These are anonymous surveys. We designed a data return form, and we started to spread the word via foundations and Suzanne. And so World Duchenne Organization, as well as several other Duchenne foundations, have been helping to spread the word about this process. And that is important because of this process. So I'll go through this in a little more detail. This is consent for this project is freely given, in that the family needs to reach out to Suzanne. And so we're trying to spread the word that if families are interested in participating, they need to reach out to Suzanne. And they can do that by contacting her at her email address, which is listed here. Suzanne, by telephone, explains the study and sends the consent form for review via email. The family then is given time to read through the material and make a choice whether or not to provide written informed consent to participate. And for families that are outside of the US, this includes GDPR, a separate GDPR consent. The family then, once the consent is in place and they are, that they understand, the family then provides the child's date of birth, the child's study site location to Suzanne. And those pieces of information, the date of birth and the study site location, allow the data coordinator to send Suzanne the child's data with just their subject number. And so Suzanne then forwards me the data with just the subject number, and then I'm able to compile the data without knowing anything about the patient's identification or anything further. Suzanne also collects the parent's name, the parent's mailing address, and or their email address in order to return the data. And all of this information is stored in a password-protected database that only Suzanne has access to. After the data is sent out, then Suzanne only keeps a record of where she sent data. The rest of the information is deleted. We will arrange for a phone interpreter, and we'll have all documents translated to your native language, and that's really important, and that was in our ethics application. And so please do let Suzanne know early if that's needed, and we're happy to arrange that for you. There are many different, as Holly touched on, there are different types of data that are collected in trials, and these include clinical efficacy measures that are measures of benefit of the drug. And these are, there's a primary outcome measure that you pre-specify as the most important outcome measure. And then there are other outcome measures that are ranked as secondary outcome measures. And in Duchenne, the clinical efficacy outcome measures, as you all know, are typically measured by time function tests or function tests like the North Star Ambulatory Assessment or the 6-minute walk test. Then there are assessments of clinical safety. These are measures of side effects, adverse events, or other health concerns. So an example would be stunting of growth or other adverse events that are reported during the trial. Laboratory measures are blood tests, typically called biomarkers. And so some of these laboratory tests are ones that are used in clinical practice, like blood sugar, and others are more exploratory. Holly used that word in her talk as well. So these are, this is research. And so there are some biomarkers or tests that are designated as exploratory because there's some information that says that they may be useful, or we're taking the opportunity to learn more about Duchenne or about the drug from studies done in the trial. And so these are all different types of data that are collected in trials. So an example of how this process might work is that this is completely theoretical example of a 4.5-year-old who completed the VBP15 002 and 003 studies. VBP15 002 was a 2-week on drug, 2-week off drug, initial PK and pharmacokinetic and safety study. And those patients then rolled over onto a 6-month extension trial called 003. They stayed on the same dose when they went from 002 on to 003. And so that trial is complete. The study closed. All the data were reviewed. The data were analyzed. They were written into a report and packaged in a way such they can be submitted to the regulatory agency. And now we're returning those data to families that have participated in those trials. And so the parents contacted Suzanne and requested his data. I discussed that. I put together a report, and I'm going to go through a little bit more detail about what that report looks like. And that report is put onto an encrypted USB drive. So what that means is that if someone were to get their hands on the USB drive, they couldn't open it without a password. And Suzanne sends that password by email. It's not with the drive itself in the mail, but by email to the parents so that they can open it when they receive it. So on the drive that was sent was a document called To Learn More. And this is a general document that provides information on the vamorolone trials, information about the outcome measures used in the trials, and links to published manuscripts. So people can look at the data, the aggregate data in more detail. And just, one of the important parts of this is making sure that people understand what data we're collecting and why, and that they can interpret the data when they receive it, or they can understand the data when they receive it. The family also received an individual data sheet. This is another document containing their child's data. And so again, this is a PDF on that drive stating what their child's dose, what dose group their child was in. In this trial, remember, there were 4 dose groups, and so that information is provided. And then information about demographics, weight, height, body mass index, results from function tests. So we show, we provide information from all of the function tests at baseline, at 12 weeks, and at 24 weeks. And then we also show, we say it can be useful to compare your son's results to the results from other boys in your son's dose group. And so we show a table of the average results for the boys in your son's dose group. Then we also, because a table of data sometimes can be more understood if it's in a graphical form, we provide the functional test data in graphical form, focusing on your son's dose group. And we'll highlight the individual patient's data with a red color notation so that the family can visualize that information better. And so this data is provided for each of the function tests. We also provide muscle testing. And so we have the quantitative muscle testing results before and after treatment with vamorolone at baseline, 12 weeks and 24 weeks. And again, the results from the other boys in the child's dose group, and in both tabular and graphical form. Biomarkers, so this was a little challenging, as Holly touched on, what to return and how do we do it and how can people understand it and will it be meaningful? And we decided to take the approach of explaining these biomarkers to people and returning the data and then trying to understand if they felt it was meaningful and why. And so we provide a table of all the different biomarkers that we're collecting, blood test, what the test is measuring. We try to explain what the test is measuring. Why is ReveraGen testing this? What are some of the limitations of the test? Like, for example, some of these tests are quite variable from day to day in a person. And so there are some limitations to these tests. And then does your doctor typically order the test in the clinic? Most of these biomarkers are not things that yet have enough, that are really useful in clinical practice. They're designed to find out information about the drug. And so that's what, before we present the data, we're saying these tests have been done for research purposes to see how treatment with vamorolone affects the tests. It's important to know that we can't return data until trials are complete in order to maintain data integrity. And so there's a regulatory process that we need to respect. Data have to be checked and reviewed and analyzed and compiled. And this is very important for regulators who are assessing the safety and efficacy of vamorolone. And so we respect that very much. And so even though it's very challenging to wait through an entire trial to find out if your child was in a placebo arm or in a treatment arm, that is the reason that we wait is for this reason, that in order to maintain the integrity of the data and have it be meaningful to regulators in order to make a decision, we all want to know if the drug is safe and if it works. And so in order to answer those questions, we need to maintain the blindedness of the data, and we can't give out the data until the study is complete. So what if I have a question about the data after they're returned? And so what ReveraGen has done is we're again turning to Suzanne as to be the touch point. If you have a question, please reach out to Suzanne for questions about the test or the clinical trial or processes regarding return of results. We will do our best to answer your question, and I can help to answer things through Suzanne in an anonymous way. And if there are any questions about your child's health, we'll ask you to speak with your doctor. And again, we point toward clinical care and clinical trial data being not the same thing, that in a trial, your son's test results are kept anonymous on purpose, and they're analyzed as part of a whole program. And to find out how your son's doing clinically, please speak to your doctors and nurses who know your child as an individual and are the right people to ask about their clinical progress. So this whole process is novel, and we fully anticipating sharing what we learn. So part of this process is learning from the families. So anonymous surveys are sent by email before and after you receive your data. And we're asking questions like, what kind of data are important to you? In what format would you like to see your data? Do parents understand what data are being collected by ReveraGen and why? And importantly, after the data are returned, what feedback should we have? Would parents repeat their decision to receive their child's data again? And are there things that we can learn from this process to improve upon it for people, to make it more meaningful? I should say that we are focused here on this individual clinical trial result return. And parents have the option to share their son's data with anyone. This is a very important issue in the Duchenne community regarding data sharing and sharing data in order to improve care for people by optimizing research results. So the Duchenne community position about data sharing, and this is from World Duchenne Organization, the optimal use and reuse of data for drug development and care, collection of data relevant to patients, patient-reported outcome measures. Placebo data should be made available. Patients should decide about the use of their own data. And patients in the community are willing and interested to share their data, but they should have that choice. And that clinical trial data should be returned to participants. And that piece is really what we're addressing in this project. World Duchenne Organization has discussed a proposal called the Duchenne Data Platform, in which patients would have power and control over use of their own data and who sees it. For example, data could be stored in a personal data locker, and then parents could give electronic consent to share de-identified data from that data locker for studies or for uses that they feel are important. And so this type of platform allows for the sharing to work more, facilitates the sharing. Whereas what we're doing is sharing directly with the families. We're not facilitating sharing outside of that. So in summary, if families wish to learn of what treatment their child was assigned to in a trial and how their child did relative to others in the same trial, the same dose group, we think they should have access to these data. And so ReveraGen has worked to develop an approach in order to provide these data directly to participant families. And then the families are able to share, they can share the data with their other family members, with their friends, or and then also with their physicians. They can share the clinical trial data. Key to these efforts are clear education of families on interpretation. And so we thought really hard about what format we should send the data back in, and we felt that it was more important to have more explanation of what we were sending them rather than just the straight data in a data format that could be shared. For this particular project, the objective was more to find out what families really want and need, and then try to understand how we could provide that, but also give some explanation and more of an educational component. And this is novel. We want to learn, and we'll share what we learned with the community, of course. And we want to say thank you to all our collaborators and stakeholder partners that have helped us with this project.
All right. Thanks so much, Dr. Conklin and Dr. Peay, for your presentations. And Laurie, also thank you for being the first in the Duchenne field to set up such a program to return clinical data to patients. Really well done. And we're happy to have you, and we're hoping that lots of companies will follow soon. Now, we've arrived at the last part of the webinar where we will have our open discussion. We still have around 10 minutes for the discussion, so I think we better get started. We have both questions related to the clinical trial itself, as well as considering the return of data. Dr. Conklin, the first question is for you. I've kind of summarized the ones. Will vamorolone be approved for everyone with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or will it be approved for only one specific group? And an add-on question is, could you give a time frame for the study, when it will be completed, and how long it will approximately take to be approved by the EMA?
So these are important questions. As far as how it will be approved, it's really hard for me to answer that question without further discussions with regulators and with analysis of the data. The trial is nearly enrolled, should be enrolled, maybe fully enrolled at this point, and then it's a 12 for the EMA. It's a 12-month study, and so we'd be looking at completing the study next summer. All the participants completing this study next summer, and then for submission of a marketing authorization application in early to mid 2021. And then, of course, then there's time for the EMA to review. So by the, it's about a 12-month review period in Europe.
All right, thanks. And another question is it possible to stop taking the Flazycort or prednisone one day and the next day taking vamorolone? Or do you first need to slowly decrease the dosing to 0 before participating in the clinical trial?
So the clinical trial, which is fully enrolled, was only enrolling boys that were steroid naive that had not been exposed to any steroids. And in clinical practice, that we don't have any data yet as far as how that transition is best to occur. We don't have any patients yet that have been treated transition from steroids to vamorolone yet.
A question about the data. How is this whole returning clinical data regulated on an EU, a European level?
Well, there's no specific regulation addressing this issue directly. However, GDPR is a data protection regulations in Europe. And in particular, one of the ways that it's regulated is by the informed consent regulations in GDPR. So informed consent must be freely given and specific under GDPR. And so that's why we take very good care to make sure that the families are informed about the project, and then that they are, that consent is freely given and specific.
All right, thanks. And what is exactly the primary source where this return data is collected? Somebody asked, was it an EDC system?
It is, so electronic data capture is where the data comes from, yes. So it's from the EDC system, yep. And one of the reasons that we wait until the trial is closed is that we're using data from the EDC that has been reviewed and checked and closed, that we've got the final data and that we're not using preliminary data to send out to people. Mm-hmm. But the source is from the EDC.
All right. And how exactly does this data looks like? Like, what can I do with it? Can I easily share it with other people? Can I share it with other machines? How does that work?
So again, we were conflicted about sending this. So there's a couple things here. One is that we wanted to return the data, but we're not in a position to create a platform for data sharing in a machine readable format. But yet we wanted to return the data to people. And we also wanted the data to be more, we wanted more information about the data to be included in the return, not just the data itself alone. But I think that this issue of machine readable format and sharing of data, I think in this way we were able to return the data in a safe, we wanted to safeguard confidentiality, and we just weren't sure as a small company how we could transfer data in a machine readable format electronically with the necessary safeguards. And so as such, I think there could be improvements made to the format in which the data are returned.
Thank you. And I have another question, because most companies, when you're participating in a clinical trial, are using this GDPR, the new European safety law for data. They keep it as a reason for not sharing the data with their participants. What would you like to say to these companies, and how could they learn from ReveraGen's approach?
So I think that I can't speak for other companies and their individual circumstances. And again, I think that we do need to keep separate the idea of data sharing, so a company sharing data with other sources versus returning data back to families. Those are two different things, really. So I think that GDPR states that people have a right to access their data. But as long as that consent is in place, which we've tried to make sure that that those consenting procedures are clearly in place. It would be, there is a lot of talk about how this could be done upfront in the consenting process, and working this in upfront into the trial design. And so that's something to consider for companies moving forward that are planning their trials and planning their consents, how this could be worked in upfront so that they didn't have to go back and reconsent people for this particular purpose.
Yeah, so it's really clear in front of them, including the rules of engagement, the expectations of enrolling a clinical trial, to have this also included.
I think that part of the problem sometimes may be that people don't know early on what projects they will want to share data, and things come up later. And then to go back and reconsent patients, especially if you're talking about a very large study, can be quite onerous. And then remember that companies they can't easily access contact information for their participants unless involving their clinical site teams. And so, we've gone around that by working with foundations to make our contact information available so that people can reach out to us. But we're not then able to have a full data set to share. There's a difference between sharing a data set and returning individual information to families.
Dr. Peay, do you have any closing remarks or thoughts from your side that you wish to add to this discussion?
I don't think so. I guess the thing I would reinforce was something that Lori just mentioned, that there is an increasing push, and this is in the EU as well as in the States, to address these issues upfront in protocol development. And I think we're making some real strides. It's going to take several years, frankly, before we have this really well figured out. But that is clearly the best approach, is to factor in both aggregate and individual return of results approaches as part of protocol development, and have a process by which that would be done, have consent for that, and also, like both of us have talked about, make sure that there are educational materials and people who are able to answer questions in a way that don't run afoul of regulations.
All right, thanks very much. Now I got one question, and I think that's one related to the Duchenne data platform. We're having here a question about what exactly is an individual locker in the Duchenne data platform. And we have Elizabeth Vroom from the Dutch Parent Project joining us, which is one of the initiators of the Duchenne data platform. Elizabeth, welcome. Could you care to explain a little bit more about these individual lockers?
Oh, thank you. Yes, first of all, I would like to thank Lori and Holly for this fantastic webinar and this really good, step in the direction we really wanted so badly for a long time. So thank you both again. The idea of the data locker is, as Lori said very clearly, it is a lot of different things. This is about returning clinical trial data, but we wanted to avoid that data of patients were scattered all around. Some at the hospital, some at the physio, some prompts the family had, whatever, and how we could combine these data in a way that they could be reused, because that is what I think the patient community wants. We don't want children to go to the same test 6 times when it could have been done in one time, or if other data are not shared. And also because data sharing can bring more, we can learn more from the data, existing data, than is already happening. So from that idea it came. Then with the Foundation 29 in Madrid, we set up a system where we have this patients can, it is like a registry, but they have all the data collected in a data locker, let's say, and they can decide who they give access to their data. So first of all, they can decide, do I give my clinician access to the data I have done? That might be good, because the clinician can check if all data in the system are appropriate. On the other hand, you might have a clinician you don't want to have access, but that is one option. The other is that with a dynamic informed consent, because that's the key then, and as Holly said, informed consent, and you said it as well, is very important. So then with the dynamic informed consent, patients can say, well, yes, I would agree or like my data to be used for this and this project, but for example, I don't want them to be used by or a certain company or by industry in general, whatever. So it gives patients much more of a say about their individual data to be reused, and ultimately patient or patient groups could also ask questions to the system. You know, you can also yourself, like if they would like to know, for example, how many patients are at this moment in this country using which steroids, we can just go for a search and find that for them. That's something you can do in other registries as well, but this choosing really to give who you give access to your data to be reused, that is really the advantage of the locker system. Everybody wants to know, but I think most people who are here online know. But if you don't know and you want to learn more, just send Suzanne or me an email, and we can explain a little bit more to you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for your answer. And actually, on that answer, we've reached the end of our webinar. If you have another question that we haven't touched base upon, please reach out to us either via email or via the website, and we'll get back to you shortly. The recording of this webinar will be made available for sharing together with a report in the upcoming days. For now, I wish to give a big thank you to all the speakers for presenting and for the audience for being here and the fruitful